Yeah, yeah. I'm like that all the time, like consistently and constantly reversing myself. And it's one of the funny things. I think we're in there live now. Yep. That even on my podcast, I find myself instead of going back and like editing. Oh, so,
You sound
so-
like you're underwater.
yeah. There's an echo coming in. Hold on, just one second.
You're muted.
How about now?
Sounds good.
Oh, good. Cool. Yeah, I notice even on my podcast, like moments where in the beginning I used to edit stuff out. Now I'm just like, yeah, I didn't mean that.
I'm the
Or
same way.
yes.
I do the same thing. I don't. You run out of time, and you're like, it can't be perfect. Everything can't be perfect. So
Okay, so I'll go ahead and get us started. I'll just go ahead and introduce you. For those of you guys who are on live and who are listening, this is my friend and one of my favorite people, Julia Cowley, and my true crime texting buddy. Julia is a retired FBI agent and criminal profiler. She spent 22 years in the FBI, investigated violent crime, white collar crime, worked in evidence response, and was on the famed behavioral analysis unit. Julie is also the host of her own podcast. I don't want to call it exactly a true crime podcast, but it is. It's called The Consult. And one of the things that I really love about The Consult is it gives you an opportunity to see what it's really truly like to be in the room during a consult that the BAU might give to law enforcement. Before working at the FBI, Julia worked at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigations, where she was a forensic scientist. She's a graduate of the University of Oregon, has a master's degree in forensic science from George Washington University. Let's see if I can get this right. And then, Julia's worked on some really cool cases along the way. What's known as the Golden State Killer, also the East Area Rapist, same case. The Long Island serial killer case, a couple other really interesting ones. And on her podcast, The Consult, they've done a lot of really cool episodes in my mind on lesser known cases, but also big cases Julia didn't work on, like the analysis you guys recently did on the JonBenet Ramsey ransom note, which was fascinating and had lots of ideas I had never seen or heard before. So today, part of what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation. Julia's been on 3 times. She'll probably be on 300 before I end the podcast, but about hey about sort of like what is the real role of a profiler. What kind of work do they do? How do they support investigations? And maybe talk about some of those cases, including, I think, two, that I think, at least I find very touching, the murders of Skyla Whitaker and Taylor Paschal-Placker in Oklahoma, and then also the unsolved murder of Phil DiMartino, which, hopefully we can, some of the conversations about that can help lead to resolution. But I wanted to start off, just with sort of a basic question about what behavioral analysis is and sort of like whether you consider it science or it's something else, and how does it contribute to investigations as opposed to the way it's depicted on television.
Well, behavioral analysis is also known as criminal profiling. And in the FBI, while we're assigned to the behavioral analysis unit, the product we produce and what we do is called a criminal investigative analysis, which is typically what people call a profile. But that's the official definition. And I think to many people, what that means is we're coming up with a profile of an unknown offender. there's been a crime and we want to know what kind of person did it. And so we are going to come up with those personality traits and characteristics. But a criminal investigative analysis can be so much more. It's an entire process. And it's funny, I was recently texting with another true crime podcast host who had covered a case, a missing persons case, and the person is believed to have been killed. But I had done the profile on that case, and they just did a great job of the coverage. And the host had asked me, how long did it take to come up with the profile? And I said, I looked back and like it took about 4 months to come up with the profile. And that was one single case. But it's really a very comprehensive process.
It's not like a day like it is on Criminal Minds. Not a day.
I wish. I mean, that's funny because people will ask me questions about a case. They'll give me like basic facts. They'll say, "Oh, do you know this case? What do you think?" And they are always very disappointed when I say, "I don't know." Like, so sometimes my husband will watch Dateline with me, and he'll be like, "Well, what do you think?" Right at the beginning, I'm like, "I don't know," and he'll be, "What good are you? What good are you?"
Why do I keep you around?
So, but it is a very long process, and it's not just looking at the case one time. Sometimes you're asking for additional information, but you're examining things, you're evaluating things, you're interpreting things, all from a behavioral perspective, not from the investigative perspective, not from the forensic perspective. Obviously, we take all that into account, but this is just looking at all the behavior, given all the facts that are available to you, the circumstances, the evidence, the actions that are exhibited before, during, and after the commission of a criminal act. So,
are you just looking at the behavior of the offender, or
no,
okay.
not just the behavior of the offender, but you're also looking at the victimology, the behavior of the victim, and the victim's, I mean, you're trying to get an entire picture of that particular victim and how they would have acted or behaved or responded in certain situations.
So
And
really
your
looking at the combination of all the
combination. And there's a lot of different things that behavioral analysis or criminal investigative analysis can provide. And it's not just a profile of an unknown offender. We get called into a lot of different cases, and we're starting to highlight those on our show. But interview strategies for people, whether they're the offenders or suspects or witnesses or even victims. We do victim questionnaires as well to try to draw out more information from victims. We would do media strategies, statement analysis, threat assessments. So there's a lot of different things, a lot of different ways that behavioral analysis can assist in a case. And it's really not, and you were talking about, is it a hard science, soft science? And it really is a very soft science, I would say. But you draw from things, you draw from your experience, you draw from your investigative experience, and not just my own investigative experience, but the investigative experience of my colleagues who are part of this process. No one person can do it. You need to have input from a lot of different people, perspectives, backgrounds. We all have a little bit of knowledge of psychology, and we all have different backgrounds. And for example, my background is, forensics and chemistry. So I do have that hard science background that I bring to the process. But then I might have another colleague who has a completely different background that can bring it to to this whole process that we participate in. It's a service that we provide to law enforcement that are looking for more assistance.
I was just curious, what kind of backgrounds do they look for? Allison Dixon just dropped in the chat. She mentioned that, profiling was one of her dream jobs since the point that she saw Silence of the Lambs. And
Same. I love that movie.
Yeah. I remember having a conversation about that one night, and I was saying, which movies are more realistic? And you said, actually, that one is. And also, wasn't your friend an extra in that?
Yeah, she was in the boxing scene and another scene. She was a new agent trainee at the time they were filming. And I would say I actually don't think it's all that accurate. There are parts
Right.
that are accurate. I mean, certainly there's some authenticity to it because they filmed at Quantico, and a lot of the extras were actual FBI agents, just like my former colleague who was an extra in it at the academy, and instructors were also part of the movie. So there's some authenticity to it, but and it's based on some the serial killer in that case is a composite of multiple real serial killers. And
Ed
so,
Gein and yeah,
yeah, but certainly no new agent trainee would be out in the field
interviewing, right.
interviewing a serial killer. No way. I mean, that takes years and years. And so I think some people at the time, I think that was a big draw, kind of like Top Gun. After Top Gun, a bunch of people wanted to go join the Navy and fly planes. But it's the same thing. I think that was a great recruiting tool at the time. But I think there was a misconception that I can just walk in and become a profiler. And it's not like that. You have to at least 10 years as a case agent investigating different violations in a in an office. It's just a special agent. I don't want to say just a special agent, but you have to start at the very beginning and develop your investigative skills as an FBI agent before you can even apply to the BAU.
So when I was covering law enforcement and covering the FBI, I think there were about 12,000, 13,000, something like that, total. I can't remember whether it was agents or employees. How many profilers? How many out of that group are actually profilers?
Maybe 30.
Okay. So
It's expanded since I was there, but there's probably more, maybe 30 to 50, what we would term certified profilers. And those are the people that are selected to be in one of the units. And there's different units. I was in the crimes against adults unit, but they have a crimes against children unit. They have terrorism. They now have a cyber unit. They have a research unit as well. So I think there's 5 units now. So I'm not really sure how many. If I had to say, probably maximum 50 certified profilers currently working for the FBI. Now, all over the country in the, there's 56 field offices of the FBI all over the country, and you have what are called coordinators. They're the BAU coordinators, and they're agents that are at the local in the the local field office, that are the liaisons between the BAU and state and local law enforcement in their area of responsibility. So they all have some training. They're not profilers, but they have a little bit of training, and they can get additional training as well. And they understand the process. They know what a profiler would need in order to provide a criminal investigative analysis to an agency. So you have a number of those, because you could have multiple coordinators in a certain office. And I was, prior to becoming a profiler, I was the coordinator, one of the coordinators in the Boston division.
What was your path to get there? I mean, how did you even get into forensic science? Was that were you, I know you were in Oregon, Tennessee's kind of far from, what was your path to
So my path was, I knew I wanted to be a forensic scientist, and that's why I majored in chemistry. And back at that time, the late 80s, they didn't really have forensic science programs as we know them now. Now there's a lot of schools offer those, but they didn't have it. And I was, just financially kind of limited to stay at a state school. And so I luckily I wanted to go to the University of Oregon. That was my dream school anyway. So I make the most of things. I see the good in everything. So my dream school, University of Oregon, and I majored in chemistry, thinking, well, I liked chemistry, believe it or not, but thinking that would give me the most opportunity to be able to work in a crime lab, because most of the disciplines in the crime lab draw upon the fundamentals of chemistry or biology.
Yeah.
And I liked chemistry better than biology. So I majored in chemistry knowing I wanted to work in a crime lab. And then after I graduated, I went to grad school, as you mentioned, at George Washington University, and I moved to Washington D.C. and I spent about a year and a half getting my master's degree, which was really fun. It was much easier to get a forensic science degree than the chemistry degree, because once I was in forensic science, I was just applying the chemistry, and I had some legal classes as well, and I took a forensic medicine class at the DC medical examiner's office, and so I absolutely loved it, and I loved Washington DC, so I did that, and then before when I was getting ready to finish my master's degree, I started to apply to different crime labs all over the country, everywhere, because the jobs are few and far between. And usually you have to apply to the state and get on a state registry, and then you get ranked, and it can take a really long time. So after grad school, I worked for about a year in a biotech lab, for a biotech company out in California. After that, I just remember one morning I got a phone call, went out for an interview to Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. I went to Nashville. I'd never been to Tennessee before, did the interview. And then a couple months later, I got a phone call that they were going to hire me. And I guess my boss, who the one of the people who interviewed me, who later became my boss, I guess told everyone, that girl from California is never coming here.
She's never actually going to come here. Why would?
He's like, she'll never come. Like, she's from California. But I rented a Ford Taurus, packed all my belongings into the Ford Taurus, and drove from California to Nashville and did my training there. And I did my training in Nashville, was ultimately assigned to the Knoxville crime lab, because I could also be a member of the evidence response team, or we called them violent crime team, or violent crime response teams at TBI back at that time. I don't know if they still call them that, but I knew I could be not only a forensic scientist in the laboratory, but also be responding to crime scenes and processing those. And that's what I really wanted to do as well. So then I had a colleague who was a mentor to me, and he applied to the FBI a couple years before I did, and he got in. And after being in the lab for a few years, I started to feel like I wanted to work my own cases rather than being like the small part. I felt like it was a very small part of these cases, but I wanted to be an investigator. I wanted to investigate murder at some point in my career. So I decided to apply to the FBI, and I was fortunate enough to be accepted. And
And from there, were you a coordinator before you went to the BAU?
yes. So I was assigned, after I graduated the FBI Academy, I was assigned to the Boston division. Again, I'd only been to Boston on a vacation before, so I was kind of a fish out of water in Boston, and I was assigned to bank fraud. And I thought, I don't want to do bank fraud. I'm a violent crime person. But, honestly, again, going back to, some people think you're going to walk into the FBI and just get to do whatever you want. That is not the case. So I was very much aware that you do not have a choice when you join the FBI, at least not right away. And you are going to get assigned wherever they need you.
Were you thinking about being a profiler as you came in?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes. I wanted to be a
people
profiler.
tell you were crazy?
Well, yes. I was very much aware that the chances of becoming a profiler, whether I got into the FBI or not, were very slim. And when I was in graduate school, we did have an FBI agent come talk to a group of students, which I attended, and somebody had asked him, what are the chances of becoming an FBI profiler? And he said 0. Like, don't think you're coming into the FBI to be a profiler. And, I know what he was saying.
Doesn't seem right.
That's what I thought to myself, my keen scientific mind, like,
yes, right.
That can't be 0. That doesn't match up. So, but I understood what he was saying. Don't don't come in, you're going to be very disappointed if you come in thinking I'm going to do this, this, and this. You really do have to kind of take what they give you. And so I was assigned to bank fraud, and I didn't really have about any kind of, I mean, obviously I took some math in college, but I wasn't really a banker, and I didn't understand, I had to learn the violation. I had to learn to work cases, and I was disappointed at first, but looking back, I realized it was the best thing for me. I learned how to really work, detailed cases, document intensive cases. I met my best friend in the bureau. We sat next to each other. She's still one of my dearest friends. I mean, how can I regret that? And so, and I just kept my head down. A lot of people will come into the bureau and they get assigned something that they don't like, and all they do is sit around and complain about it. And who's going to want to work with you? What supervisor is going to say, I want that person on my squad, if all they do is complain? So I just kept my head down, did some really good work, and then they were going to be disbanding my squad. And so they were going to actually, not disbanding, but combining my squad with another squad's, and not everybody was going to be able to stay. So a few of us were going to get transferred, and I didn't ask to go anywhere. I thought, well, if they keep me, then great. If I get transferred, then we'll just see what happens. And I was selected by the supervisor of the Public Corruption Civil Rights Squad, who felt he had some good interactions working with me in a couple of other cases where we had some overlap. And he requested that if you're going to get rid of anybody, I want this agent. And so I went to that squad, Public Corruption Civil Rights, and I stayed there until I went to BAU. And it was the greatest work that I did.
Yeah.
And even though it was white collar, which you wouldn't necessarily think would translate to the BAU, there was so much variety. And I really, my time on the bank fraud squad, my time on the Public Corruption Civil Rights, I learned how to be a really good investigator from,
How to work a case, right?
how to work good cases, how complex cases, how to put things together. And it wasn't just all white collar. There was some violent crime. I did some drug cases that involved public officials. So I did get some violent crime experience. And of course, this whole time, I'm also part of the evidence response team. So I'm still keeping up my skills there. And, by the time, it's just sometimes timing, you can get really lucky. But when I applied to the BAU, they were, I don't want to say under pressure, but they were under some pressure to develop, in the Crimes Against Adults unit, develop more of a white collar program within the Crimes Against Adults. Yeah, so it really benefited me at the time to have that white collar background. So when I joined the unit, I was not only working the violent crime cases, but I was working with my colleague Susan, who's on the consult, Susan Kostler, and she was in charge of the white collar program. We were doing research into high level white collar offenders, and she was spearheading that, and I was part of that. And we were starting to get in white collar cases that we would provide interview strategies on. And so it was kind of a combination. So I think, my combination of having this violent crime and white collar background really benefited me at the time. And sometimes it's all about the timing, and it worked out very well for me. And so that was my path.
Yeah, it just makes me think, bringing up the white collar piece of it, and one of the things, thinking about like such a small unit, such a specialized unit, what is sort of like the criteria for the types of cases that the BAU gets brought into? Because I know a lot of sort of profiling in the quote unquote sense, the general sense, has to do with statistics, right? We know that certain percentage of, if X happens, Y happens, or, the family's the first place that you look. So I can't imagine those are the cases where you bring in the BAU. I would imagine it's the cases where the stats don't always pan out, or it's a complete whodunit, or what is the criteria? How do they accept cases?
I mean, I just remember we accepted almost every case that we could, because sometimes even when you have the statistics, you might want an interview strategy for somebody
Mm,
because you don't have the evidence. Like statistically, if somebody dies in the home, probably somebody in the family killed them. So the law enforcement may know exactly who did it, and they just may not have it. So they want maybe an interview strategy. So there's no one set criteria, and I'm not aware. I mean, I wasn't the one. I mean, I guess there was a time where too I was actually acting unit chief, so I did have to make decisions about cases and who they get assigned to. But I'm not aware of anyone who ever came to our unit, at least when I was there, to that asked for help that was turned away in some
mm,
way. But sometimes, Jason, people will ask for something and we'll look at it and we'll say, we really can't do that, but maybe
not
this is what you need, or
yeah.
maybe we can provide this instead. So maybe guide them in a way that we think would be more useful for what, the kind of case that they have. But we would look at cases where it seemed very obvious who did it, and maybe the police or the investigators are just looking for a fresh set of eyes, some new ideas, some strategies to try to bring closure.
It's funny. In all my reporting days, covering places like the ATF, the FBI, NYPD, and whoever, I never really tripped across, I trip across the fact that the BAU was involved in something after the fact or something like that. But the only time I actually tripped across BAU was in actually covering a case. It was BAU agents who were serving as jury consultants for the prosecution. And I was like, this is wild. They're actually helping them, as a part of and it just really sort of made me think much more broadly about what
Right.
BAU.
And that's another thing we had done. This is before my time, but there were agents in the Crimes Against Children's unit that had served as jury consultants for the Michael Jackson trial.
Mm, I didn't know.
And I served as one on another high profile case in Washington, D.C. as well. And there was a mistrial in that. But so that's another service that could be provided. Prosecution strategies. I mean, how are you going to present this case? How are you going to, what's the motive? And so there's a lot of different ways to utilize the services of the BAU.
And I know you've worked on some cool cases, at least in my mind, many that aren't the biggest cases. I find them all pretty fascinating, but I know you worked on Long Island serial killer case, the Joe DeAngelo case, which I know goes by many different names, the Israel Keys case, and just curious about what kind of role you guys played in that case or those cases.
Mhm.
I imagine it was different for all of them, or different, certainly different agencies and relationships, but what
Yeah.
kind of investigative support did you have?
Well, like in the Golden State Killer case, and it wasn't called that at the time. We didn't know who had done it either. So I called it the East Area Rapist Original Night Stalker. So the ear. Um, and that was just developing a profile of the offender. What type of person were they looking for? And providing investigative suggestions and just overall impressions, linkage analysis on that case, linking, first of all, were all the offenses linked together or not? Because sometimes if you have a series going on and and any crime that happens or any violence that occurs, they'll attribute it to a single offender, and sometimes they're not connected. So it was looking at all the offenses to see, are they all connected, and then connecting a series, the Visalia series, to the Sacramento. So there was a lot there. Now with the Long Island serial killer, I do want to say that we were involved very early on, the very early stages, and we did not continue to be involved. I don't think any FBI continued to be involved past very early stages.
Right.
And so it was very preliminary, and it was developing, a profile and characteristics. And I should say we weren't working with all the information that they developed over time. So we didn't have everything at the time. So it was very preliminary. And what was the other case you had asked about?
Yeah, I had
Israel Keys.
Mhm.
So those, we were involved in the two different cases. The couriers who were abducted by Israel Keys from their home in Vermont, and we were doing an assessment of that, trying to we did a lot of victimology and really just trying to determine, are they alive or dead? Did they leave on their own accord? Is this an abduction? What kind of person would have abducted them? We were providing a lot of investigative suggestions. And then later when he offended in Alaska and took Samantha out of the kiosk, kidnapped her out of the kiosk, we were involved almost right away.
Mhm.
And so it was all real time. We were gathering
Were
information.
you guys shocked or surprised? Was it the same group of profilers working on both of those cases, or were you surprised
Yes.
when you found out?
No, we were. So those of us that do the consult, Bob, Susan, and I, we were involved in both of them. And we had other different people, but the three of us were involved. And Bob was the lead profiler on the couriers. None of us were the lead on Samantha Koenig, but we were all very involved in that. And that was a lot of investigative suggestions. It was a lot of you need to find out everything we can about Samantha. Just everything that we would advise early on in an investigation to make sure that they're getting. And of course, then the offender who was, identified as Israel Keys started communicating with the family, and we were involved in that, and through all of it. And then when he was interviewed, we found out he was confessing to murdering the couriers. And I would say that was probably the most shocked I was in my career at the BAU, is to find out that those were connected. I mean, it was there's just looking. I think we've been asked before. We're actually participating in a documentary on the case, the three of us, and the case. It's on Israel Keys, and the entire story is being told through the eyes of all law enforcement that was involved. So it'll be a very interesting perspective. But one of the preliminary questions they asked, were you guys surprised, or did it? And we're like, yes. I mean, never. It was jaw dropping that they were connected. No, and then that's what they asked. I'd like to be able to say, oh yeah, now that we know, but I don't think we ever would have made the connection. I mean, certainly we see similarities, but I think because the victimology was very different, and the geography, you can't get much further from, Anchorage, Alaska to Essex Junction, Vermont. I mean, there's about as far apart as you can get in the United States. And I just don't think we ever would have connected them had he not confessed. So it was so that's those are the services we were providing in those cases.
So Robert Palmer from the Broken Systems podcast is asking whether there's a profile that you can mention that was spot on and one that really missed the mark. And I have an idea to get us started on that one. I was just thinking, as you were talking about the original Night Stalker, that similar to Keys, there are a lot of big differences between the early cases and the later cases, including the fact that he wasn't killing anyone in the earlier cases. And I always found it fascinating that you were able to make the connection through other behavioral things. So I don't know whether that was spot on, but I'm guessing it was.
Which one?
DeAngelo. Yeah, yeah.
I wasn't 100% right, but there's a great research paper that was done by a professor at the University of Texas who compared all the different profiles that were done over the years on on the Golden State Killer, and um, you know, trying to compare what was predicted and what was right, and some of it is intangible. You can't really tell, but other ones they could prove right or wrong. Yeah, I know what I got right, and I got most of it right, but I also know where I missed, and it was definitely the age, right? I mean, I
Mm,
had the age range right,
mhm,
but because I thought he would be younger than he was, um, I didn't think he would have been old enough to have been in the military. I certainly didn't think he was in the
mm,
military for various reasons. I
right,
didn't think he was in the military at the time he was offending, which a lot of investigators did. But
mhm,
I actually didn't believe he had ever been in the military, but probably had a very strong interest in the military because then the reason for this was because there's another series that I wasn't aware of that had
mm,
occurred prior to Visalia. And
okay.
so I was thinking or interpreting that Visalia is where he started. So I was putting him younger,
Somebody younger, right?
and come to find out, there's a whole other series of burglaries that were going on that investigators now believe were probably him. So I think that's where I missed thinking that he had never been in the military. Now, if I put him a little older, I would have said he might have been in the military. So, but I like the question. I can answer that because um, we have 2 shows coming up, but it's next. It's like the 3rd show on our queue right now, and it's a murder out of Union County, New Jersey, and we have one of the detectives on our show, and he told us that our profile was 110% right.
Mm.
So, which is why I had
He
him
needs
on,
to work
but
on his math too.
yeah, that case, it was the murder of Diane Zaleski. She was 54 years old. She was murdered in her home. They had done a significant amount of investigation and brought the case to us after about 8 months. I mean, they had just done so much, and they were just kind of coming up empty-handed. So, like, here, take a look. And so we gave investigative suggestions, but we did an offender profile, and it was like the detective, his words, not ours, 110% right. So I was really happy about that. And I would say that I cannot think of something that we've ever
Where you
completely
were
missed the
shocked by
mark.
how long.
I can't. I'm sure there is, like, oh, that was, but there are always elements to things where you're like, oh, I wouldn't have thought that, or sometimes I think where I get surprised by people, like, is when people say, oh, they had no violence in their past, and I'm always like, are you sure? Because um or they don't offend again. That's
Well, that the violence
certain.
may not be criminal, right? It may not have
Right.
led to a charge or an arrest.
Right. Yeah. But I can't think of anything really completely missing, where we just had it completely wrong. I mean, there's been times where I'm aware that you say, oh, the offender is most likely a white offender, and they turn out to be a black offender. Um,
So Robert's asking, hold on. Robert's asking my favorite question about serial killers. But before we dive into that, I wanted to ask you one thing about the original Night Stalker that I always found interesting. Because we talk about the idea of like serial offenders and sexual sadists having fantasies. I in listening to it and listening to your episodes on it and paying attention to the case, I feel like the burglary was the thing. Um,
yes.
tell me about that, and then we can get to whether Israel Keys was a genius or a lunatic.
So there is, for some burglars, and many serial sexual killers start out as burglars, and there can be a sexual component for some people t- to burglarize, and going into someone's home and occupying their space and taking their things or moving them around. And so there's this sexual component to it, and it was called sexual burglary. And it's Lou Schlesinger, who is a professor at John Jay College, wrote about it in one of his books. He's one of the books he edited called Serial Offenders. And when you see burglaries that occur and there's like maybe symbolic behavior or behavior that's not necessary for the
Touching
crime.
things, but
Yeah.
not necessarily taking, things like that, maybe.
Right. Or sexual, going through the
Yeah.
underwear drawer or something, some
Right.
things are obviously sexual and other things are like, why are they spending so much time here? And
Mhm.
those are the things. So when you start having maybe a series of crimes, let's say there's a serial rapist in the area going into homes, instead of looking at, okay, let's look at somebody who's got sex crime background, let's look at burglars, people who've maybe been stopped for burglary, loitering, trespassing,
Mm.
peeping. So I think when you have people who are going into homes, particularly when the homes are occupied, you have a problem. That is a person that I would be very concerned about and their future behavior. So I know people have a hard time in like relating burglary to a sex crime, but there's a real sense, I think, of taking control from somebody and
Mhm.
being in their space.
Yep.
And a lot of these crimes are about control.
Yep. And I think that that idea that anytime a criminal does something that is totally unnecessary, that increases the likelihood of them being caught, but they still need to do it over and over again, you kind of look out for
Right. And that's why I linked the Visalia ransackings. The Visalia ransackings were just a series of burglaries where the offender would go in, ransack the house. It was during the day. Most of the time, people were not home, and it was very intensive. And there were signs that there was a sexual component to these. Particularly, he was going into underwear, lingerie drawers, and there were some other things going on at the scenes that I thought these are sexual burglaries. And what we noticed about the East Area Rapist was this reliance on burglary and the fact that he spent a lot of the time in the house before any sexual assault at all. He always ransacked the homes first.
Mm.
And I really thought that they were connected, and I think there were many detectives that did not think they were connected because I think it was, I think it was too much of a leap to say you went from burglary to sexual assault to murder. But if you really, and these burglary reports were very short. You might get one or two lines in them because they were considered nuisance crimes. Nobody was hurt. Not, there were some things of value stolen, but it was more, he was just messing up people's homes and taking a few things here and there. So they weren't really long reports, but contained within those reports, you'd find these little nuggets of, oh, he took one earring of a pair. And then you'd go and you'd look at like maybe, one of the cases in Sacramento where the offender, one of the victims knows he took one earring from a pair. And that those were the little things that I was connecting, these little similar things that
Not about
maybe,
right.
right, not about burglary, not about financial gain. There's another purpose. And it wasn't that he wasn't gaining, he was taking things of value, but he was also doing these things that just didn't make sense. And some of the behavior was so similar, but there were, these little things were contained in thousands and thousands of pages of reports.
Or
And so you couldn't just say, okay, he's just a burglar here and he's a rapist here, so they're not connected. It really took these, just going through it in very fine detail, and making those connections. And so at the end, I was very certain. I can never say 100%, but I was pretty certain that these were connected. And up until he was arrested, there were some investigators that didn't think that they were connected because they were, the composites were different.
mm.
Never trust composites.
Right, which we'll actually get to in a moment. But, Keys, genius or lunatic? I tend to think, yeah,
He's not a genius.
yeah.
He was smart. I mean, he's not stupid. He was well prepared. He was smart enough to know, not to at least until the very end, not to commit any crimes where he lived. And I think, moving around geographically certainly was a benefit to him, and he certainly planned well in advance. But I we didn't find him to be like this evil genius by any means. And
Mhm.
certainly at the end, he wasn't very smart. I mean, he did not even realize that he could be tracked through using a victim's credit card.
Right.
And he
Right.
was just moving along, and they just
Mhm.
tracked him until a very alert trooper spotted the car, and not that smart. But he thought he was smarter than everybody.
And a lot of what we know about Israel Keys is based on what Israel Keys has told us. So it's really hard to, like, for example, he said, he randomly picked the couriers, but there's so many details there where I'm like, yeah, that one doesn't feel particularly random, or,
There's some randomness in not having a prior relationship with him,
Mhm.
but there's a reason he chose them. I mean, he had his reasons for him. It wasn't
His
completely
list.
random.
Yep.
The house looked right to him.
It's
They
located on a corner-ish spot.
exactly. There were some, he certainly had reasons, and that's part of the victim selection process. And he had his process, and so I can't say it was completely random, but the fact that there was no connection to them in prior relationship made it just very difficult to connect him, and likely would have not ever been connected. Well, eventually forensics hopefully would have connected him because he but yeah, it was behaviorally probably
Not
not going to connect them. No.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Hard to connect from the BAU
Yeah.
perspective without more. So I wanted to ask you about two cases, the two cases I mentioned before. I wanted to ask you both about, we'll first start off with the uh, deaths of Taylor Paschal-Placker, who was an 11-year-old, and Skyla, or excuse me, was a 13-year-old, and 11-year-old Skyla Whitaker. They were two best friends who, uh, attended a combined fifth grade and sixth grade class at a public school in, uh, I never pronounce it right. It's a Weleetka, or
Weleetka.
Weleetka,
Mhm.
Oklahoma. I do know that it's a creek name for running water, which is interesting because there were so many, yeah, streams in this. And the back when they were, I think it was 2011, there were probably about 900 people in the town. The two girls were cheerleaders. They were, really close. Uh, the city is very rural. It's like 90 miles east of Oklahoma City, about 70 miles south of Tulsa. And it's like not far, though, from the Muscogee Nation tribe, the Seminole Nation, native reservations. Um, and, the way I've always understood the story, and I may not have the facts perfectly right, is that the two girls go out on a Sunday. I think it was about 5 o'clock on a Sunday. And it's very similar to the Delphi murders of Abby Williams and Liberty Germain, down to the fact that they were both headed toward a bridge. But, they go out on, and that they were just headed out on a walk. They head out on a walk. And, in this case, Skyline and Taylor never make it to the bridge on, I think it was called Bad Creek, that they were headed on. And instead, Taylor's grandfather found them shot multiple times in a ditch on a dusty road, in this town of only 900 or so people, and no real clues about what had happened in the case. I know that they had an early sketch, which I'll show in just one second. But I was just wondering, from your perspective, tell us a little bit about like your involvement in the case. I know it was very early in your BAU space, but go ahead.
Mhm. Well, so this happened. They were murdered on June 8th, 2008, and I heard about it on the news. I was still in Boston. I was not at the BAU yet. And I just thought, what kind of person could kill two little girls like this? And the news was exactly as you reported. They went out for a walk. This is on the same, this was a dirt road. It was on the same road where Taylor lived with her grandparents who had raised her as their own. And she knew her biological mom, but her biological mom was more like a sister to
Mm,
her. So those were the family dynamics. And I just followed the case in the news, just every now and then checking the news to see, have they caught the killer yet? Who would do this? And then I got to BAU. And as I mentioned, I was assigned to the Crimes Against Adults unit. But as part of our training, we have to work cases in the other units as well. 2 cases I think we had to be responsible for. So I did have to do 2 cases in the Crimes Against Children's unit.
mm,
And one day I happened to just look to see if there had been any updates on the case. And I found a news report that the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation was going to be asking for the assistance of the FBI's BAU,
mm,
because it had been about, I'm trying to think exactly when we got him, but I think it was maybe about 3 years after. So they had done everything that they could up to that point. And I think they're just like, let's just have another set of eyes take a look at it. So I saw that and I asked my supervisor if I could work this case. And he said, well, go down and ask the other supervisor if you could work on this case as part of your training. So I did, and they allowed me to. And I worked the case with another agent in the Crimes Against Children's unit. And it was a little surreal for me to, for these few years, wondering what kind of person would do such a thing. And then it became my job to figure that out. So that's how I got involved in it. And the case came in and it was assigned to me, and I spent a lot of time on it. I went out to Oklahoma. I met with the local FBI office as well as the investigators with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. They took me out to the crime scene. We spent several days going over the entire case, asking questions. One of the things I asked them to do was we talk about developing victimology. There were a lot of different rumors and, oh, they came across a drug lab and this was a revenge for drug killing, or Taylor's grandfather was involved in drug dealing and this was revenge for that. And so I really wanted to know what's true and what's not true. And none of that was true. I mean, her grandfather was not involved in drug dealing. And um, so I asked them to give these questionnaires to people that knew the girls, their friends, families, teachers, so that we could get a really good understanding of what risks they had in their lives. Was there somebody who had perhaps a long-standing need for retribution of some sort? And what I learned about them, just to kind of boil it down to, they were very low-risk victims. They both came from good, stable homes with families that adored them. They were very well liked in school. They had a lot of friends. As you mentioned, they were cheerleaders. They also played on the basketball team. They loved the musical, High School Musical. I think it was a movie. They just loved that. So when they were found, they had spent the weekend together at Taylor's house. And the day before, they had walked to the bridge as well. But they had also spent time like writing High School Musical names on their bodies with Sharpies. So they had like Zac Efron's name, and
mm.
they were just typical girls. They didn't have
Did you
access
did you
to.
find them, like, thinking about that? I knew you know you grew up in Oregon and rural area. Did you find them relatable?
I did, because I grew up on a dirt road, and I used to go walk out on that dirt road. I used to go running on the dirt road, and I just felt, wow, just I felt so safe out there, and I'm sure they did too. So I always find something to relate to on any case, whether it's a victim themselves that I have something in common with, whether it's we're going to talk about the Phil DiMartino case, but I relate to his sister because I'm a big sister. I always find something I can relate because of a detective. There's always something that you find that gives it meaning to you. There's always something. And this case, obviously, I could relate because I felt like I grew up in a similar area, even though they're in Oklahoma, I was in Oregon. And so they were just very typical, and they didn't have access to cell phones or computers. I mean, Taylor had a cell phone, but all the phone records showed she only texted her grandparents and only called her grandparents. She was not communicating with anybody else. They didn't, they only used computers for homework. Um,
And so that's part of how the victimology is narrowing your pool.
yeah. It just became that they were extremely low risk victims. So what it boiled down to, that the motive for this murder happened on the road that day. Whatever happened
Mm.
happened that day, and the offender's motive. And so what does that tell us about an offender? I mean, what could these two girls, who were wonderful girls who didn't cause trouble, what could they do to somebody that would cause them to kill them?
How
And
do
so
you
that
Oh, sorry. I
no,
was
I
gonna
was
sort of just to that point. How do you then sort of like exclude things? Because I know the way it eventually goes, like it being a sexually motivated crime. Is it the combination of the crime scene and the victimology?
yeah.
Yeah.
And certainly the crime scene played a big portion, not only their victimology, but one of the things, they were shot with two different weapons, both of them. And so the thought was there has to be two offenders. And so that was another question I wanted to answer. Is there were many questions that I wanted to answer, but one of them is, it one or two offenders? What was the motive for this? Why on this day did they end up dead? Is this a local person or not? So there are all these different things, and then come up with a profile of the offender. And certainly their victimology played a huge part. And obviously I can't rule out everything, but
Mhm.
it's all about probabilities. I'm like, okay, I don't see anything in their life. They're about as low risk as you can get. So what happened that day? And what kind of person are we dealing with, that somebody feels that they have to kill them? And so I thought, you're really dealing with somebody who really has absolutely no empathy for anybody, and probably has the type of personality that they react very quickly, and they get upset easily,
And
or
that
they're
whatever it was happened between those corners on that. Yeah.
right. And so the picture starts coming together. And certainly, and I think in this case, my background in forensic science and my background in processing crime scenes really helped, because I was able to kind of piece back together using. So I just want to say the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation crime scene team just did a phenomenal job. I mean, the notes that they took, and like, I would have a question, I would find somewhere in the notes that somebody wrote it down through their observations of
Mm.
taking notes at the crime scene. And they did a very good job of documenting the crime scene with sketches and photographs, because I'm not there. This, I'm looking at this 3 years later. And the autopsy, and taking into account the the calibers of the weapons, and the placement of the bullets, and trying to piece back together as best I could as to what happened. And what I
And
was able to
told you the
determine,
story of
yeah,
what.
it all starts to come together. And the one thing I was pretty certain about is that the crime could have been committed by one person. You didn't need two people, even though
Mm.
they were shot with two different weapons. Nothing had to have happened simultaneously. It wasn't like one victim was shot with one gun and the other one shot with another gun. It wasn't like that. It was like, so I thought it was like, okay, the offender used one gun on both of them, and then went and got another gun. And then that's where statistics comes into play. When you have, a double homicide, or multiple weapons used, statistically, does that mean you have two offenders? Does it mean you have one offender? And statistically, we're still looking at one offender, even under these
Mm.
circumstances. So because there wasn't anything that suggested to me that this had to be two offenders, a probability, it was probably one offender. Now, is that 100% accurate? We don't know. I mean, it's the best we can do.
But
Uh,
random, multiple guns, etcetera. It
yeah,
it
I mean, you
tells you
just
something about the person, right? That they
mhm.
happen when you know it's random and they had multiple guns.
Yeah. So I came up with a profile. The other thing that was interesting is that, when you look at it, and if you're going off the premise, which I was, that the motive was formed that day on the road, that they weren't meeting anybody, there wasn't somebody who was stalking them, going to kill them, or had planned to do this. And what we know is that this was they happened upon each other, and this person had at least two weapons with them at the time of the murder. And so and one of them they knew to be a Glock, and the other was a 22. We don't know what kind, but it was a 22. And so I remember telling during the briefing that I was giving, the verbal briefing of the profile and my observations, I had said, well, this person's a gun nut. And they laughed. They're like, this is
Isn't everyone in Oklahoma?
this is Oklahoma, ma'am. And I said, no. I said, I understand that. I grew up in a rural town. I'm not talking about somebody who's got a hunting rifle and his gun rack in the back of his truck. This is not what I'm talking about. This is going to be somebody who is a gun nut, who, that cherishes his guns. He probably brags about them. He practices with them. This is people who know him. I mean, the other thing was he was a very good shot. He shot very quickly. He shot it's high stress situation. He was very accurate. So I thought, this is somebody who knows what they're doing. And people who know him will know he's a gun nut. This isn't just like your normal hunter person, or even a person who's a gun collector. This is somebody who is a little bit wacky about it. And it's not the technical term I use, but just, somebody with a familiarity with guns, who will likely boast and brag about their use of guns, who's probably practices, and people who know this person will know that he carries around at least two guns all the time, at least. And one of them is a Glock and the other one's a 22. So those are some of the things that I was putting on. This is what you're looking for. Obviously the stuff about the lack of empathy. I definitely thought it was a local person. I did not think, you were talking about the composite, they really had focused on a potential, stranger out there. It's,
Oops.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, the shaggy haired stranger that nobody really, I don't know if anyone ever really saw a stranger, but going out, this is where going out there was so critical, was that it is all these series of dirt roads that are numbers. They don't even have names on them. They're just numbered roads. And even in the 911 call, when Taylor's grandmother is calling 911, she's trying to explain to the 911 operator where they're located, and the 911 operator is very confused. But driving out there, I was completely lost, and I thought, there is no way some stranger wandered 3 miles off the interstate to come kill these girls. This is a local person. They probably live pretty close by. Which is scary. It's scary in such a small community. And Weleetka is a small town, but it's also surrounded by other communities like Henrietta. And so it borders other towns that are a little bit bigger, but and the other thing about this road, on the weekends, and this happened on a Sunday, it's used as a cut through by the locals. So it actually gets more traffic on the weekends. Families going to ball games and things like that from one town to another, they cut through on this road. So I just thought, this is not a stranger. This person is part of the community. And I don't usually say this. I said, you probably already interviewed him as well. He's been stopped. Yeah, they had stopped him. Yeah, because one of the things that they were going through the state trying to interview and talk to anyone who owned a Glock. And he had been contacted, and he had said he sold it, or it was stolen. I forget what the story was, but he didn't have it. But they went back, and he actually was one of the many people. That's how thorough their investigation was. It was so thorough that I was pretty sure they had probably talked to him. And I wouldn't normally say that under the circumstances, but because it was such a small area, I figured he's probably one of the people. And when I say small, it's still hundreds and hundreds of leads that they had to cover.
What was his? It's Kevin Sweet here. What was his
Yeah.
story about what happened? Because I bring it up because there's a question about empathy that's in the chat, and I know he made arguments that made it sound like it was a psychotic episode, but he also killed his fiance.
Yeah, he had killed his fiance, and that's how he came on the radar, is that she went missing and they ultimately found her burned body on his grandfather's property, which was right down the road from where the girls were killed. And but when they interviewed him, it was the same lead detective who was the lead on Taylor and Skyla's murder, and he was interviewing Kevin. He's like, he fits the profile. This is him. I'm convinced it's him. And but what was your question? I'm sorry. I got sidetracked.
Saying, what was his story about?
Oh, yeah, that's right. So, yeah, he said that he was driving down the road. This is when they were when the lead investigator was interviewing him about the murders of Taylor and Skyla. He said he was driving down the road. He saw two monsters coming at him, so he shot them, and then he got back in his car and they started coming at him again, and so he got another gun and shot them. And he claimed that he had stopped. He had, and I'm going to use his words, he pulled over to take a leak. So the thing about this, even though he was he was examined by psychiatrists, psychologists, and determined not to be crazy. Like he was totally faking this.
Right.
And but it wasn't a perfect confession in terms of taking complete accountability for what he had done, but he admitted being there, he admitted seeing them, he admitted killing them. And the other thing that was so interesting to me was that the way he described it was exactly the sequence of events that I had come up with in the profiles, that this is how it happened. And this is the sequence of events that occurred in terms of the shooting, of who got shot first and who ran. And then he went back and he got another gun and then he shot him again. And only the offender would know that.
Right.
So
and that's another way in addition to the gun.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, the investigators didn't need much. They were pretty sure it was him. It wasn't like, oh, this is a big moment. He got the crime scene right. But then, when we go back to the motive, why did this happen? And you're talking about this lack of empathy. So everyone said, oh, nobody knows why he did it. We don't know. And I don't feel that way. I feel like we do know why he did it. So if we go back to what he said, why he was there, I was pulled over to take a leak. Well, what is he really saying? He's saying he exposed himself. He was, or at least he was. I mean, because what do you have to do if you're going to use the restroom on the side of the road? You expose yourself.
If you were going to pull over,
and
take a leak, why would you do it beside two girls?
Right. Especially, it's not like they came around a corner. This is a long road. You can see in both directions. You saw the map. You can see in both directions a long way. He knew they were there. It wasn't like they just happened upon him. So what I believe happened is that he exposed himself to them, and they either threatened they were going to tell on him, or one of I think it was Taylor's sister, who was actually her biological mother. I might have this wrong, but they had a close family member that had worked with him at a fast food restaurant. And so there may be one of them, Taylor may have recognized him and said something. I don't know. But at some point, I think he felt like, I've done this. They're going to tell on me, whether they said they were, or he perceived that they were, or they've recognized me. And I think that is the motive. I think that he exposed himself to them, and then he felt like, I can't let them go back to the house and tell anybody what just happened. So he killed them.
Him telling this psychotic story is either malingering for defense or some kind of shame he felt, or
I think it's kind of, I don't know if it's shame in terms of like how we would normally feel shame.
Normal shame.
Yeah. But when, we listened to jail calls of his, and they would send them to me. And at the time, it was prior to he's been charged at this point with the murder of his fiance. Her name was Ashley Taylor. And he has not been charged with the murder of Tyler or Skyla, but his mother tells him on one of the phone calls, they're going to charge you with the murder of those two little girls. And his response to her is, what is this going to do to my reputation?
Yes. 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 Right.
I mean, talk about,
Right.
this kind of self-centered lack of empathy. I mean, you name it. He has no regard for anybody but himself. And it's not even his regard for his future or what have I done? It's like, what is it going to do to my reputation? I mean, and really to think he had all that great of a reputation to begin with just kind of tells you that he's got this kind of, he's not really all there in terms of realistically taking a look at himself and who he really is.
So we've got Sophie asking, which I don't know whether you have the answer to this question. I have my own thoughts on it. Do you think people can learn or develop empathy?
I don't know that I'm qualified. I mean, just from my own experience and maybe my cynical view of the world, no.
Yeah, no.
But I mean, I'm just not. I really don't know. But I'm just gonna say I don't think so. I don't think somebody who does something like this ever can learn to develop true empathy.
Yes, that's exactly it. So, like, I think I put it in two buckets. I think you can learn empathetic behaviors. And that can be a very good thing in the sense that if you've made the commitment, like, I am not empathetic, but I want to function in this world, or I want to be good to people or whatever it is, you can learn and mimic empathetic behaviors. And we see this in a lot of sort of like neurodiversity situations with clients. But I also think on the other hand of it, you could be a totally non-empathetic person in this, I guess, this empathy that we're talking about, where it's primary and it's about caring, and you can mimic those behaviors. But then I think there's this other piece that empathy is almost too broad of a concept, because I do think in some ways serial killers are empathetic if you look at the definition of they can read other people's emotions. They certainly can, but they don't respond with the caring response. They respond with this other response. So in a weird way, I think what it really is, can we make people care? I don't think so.
No,
I don't think we can make them care.
yeah, and I think I've changed my thoughts on empathy. Or I used to think, and not really knowing, because we were talking about this before we started recording, getting into the mind of somebody. I don't really believe I can do that. I can try to understand why they did it, but I'll never know how they feel. And I used to have this sense that they have no feeling at all. They just don't care at all. But actually, after hearing, it's actually Carrie Rawson, who is the daughter of Dennis Rader, who is known as BTK. And she has talked about, well, I should say, I've seen some of the things that she's discussed regarding her father, about he had a lot of feelings.
Yeah.
And so you can learn a lot from people who, have grown up or lived with, these types of offenders, where you think they don't care about anything, but sometimes they really do. A lot of that can be internalized. So like somebody like Kevin Sweat, I think he has a lot of emotion, a lot of feeling, but it's all like turned inward. Like, why is this poor me? But he probably has a lot of these feelings of this overwhelming, things are being done to me all the time, so I don't know that to be a fact, but I just want to say I used to think people had no feelings. And I think that maybe I was wrong about that. They probably do have a lot of feelings, but
probably in some ways too many. I mean, like an overwhelming amount. I remember this one client that I had who he at one point, wild story. Well, so he became my client because one day in school, he took a keyboard on a computer, like those old school with the thick keyboards, and smashed it against the back of another kid's head so hard that keys were stuck in his head, like when they pulled it away. And apparently this guy had offended him a year before. And he waited and he sat on it for a year and did this. Fast forward, much later, this kid is robbed in a drug deal. He walks to the house of the kid who set him up, rings the doorbell. His 13-year-old sister comes down and says her brother isn't there. And he's like, okay. And then she walks up the stairs and he starts firing bullets into the door and almost hits her, right? So stone, unbelievably cold, clearly psychopathic behaviors. But he genuinely cared about things like dogs and his sister and animal welfare, almost cared about things too much. It intensely affected him. And I just thought to myself, it's about where that emotion is focused more than whether yeah.
And I think it could be dependent on the individual. Some people probably have no emotions or feelings, and other people have a lot of feelings. And these, like, as we call them, injustice collectors, everything they perceive is being done to them or happening to them when it's really not. So you have these people that have these overwhelming feelings, and I think you just deal with different people all the time, and you really don't know. You have to look at a case by case basis. At least somebody like me does. The experts in psychology, they probably have a better global view. But for me, it's just about looking at an individual case. And certainly I am not qualified to diagnose anybody. I just look at the characteristics. Some of those characteristics may be in line with certain kind of personality disorders, but it's not for me to diagnose. And I don't try to. Do I think certain offenders might be high on the narcissistic list, or this narcissism scale, or the psychopathy checklist? Yes. But until they're officially analyzed by an expert and run through all the battery of tests, we don't really know for sure.
And it's like Bob said, Bob Drew, your co-host, once you've seen a serial killer.
If you've seen one serial killer, you've seen one serial killer. I completely agree with that. We hear a lot of, like, these guys do this, these guys do that. I think there's a lot of characteristics they have in common, but like I say, you get asked a lot of questions. What about this guy? What about this guy? And I'm like, I'd really have to look at the case, because the cases that I have worked on, when you look at, like, for example, looking at Dennis Rader versus Joe DeAngelo, they're different. They both did terrible things. They both killed a lot of people, but they are different. And I can cite many reasons how they're different. And I'm sure Joe DeAngelo is different from, the Long Island serial killer. And, we see differences there. We see differences between many of these offenders. And
there's a part of us internally that wants to have a template. So when we see that guy on the street who does X, Y, or Z, then we get on. But that's not
you just can't. I'm convinced there, there are some similarities. They'll all have some similar characteristics, but there are also some, they're very different. I once heard somebody, prior to Joe DeAngelo being arrested, and there was a special on the case before it was solved, and it was a retired profiler saying that when they catch the Golden State Killer, he'll talk, because they all want to talk. And knowing the case and knowing how he behaved, I thought, he's not going to talk. He's not like that. He's not a talker. He's not somebody who is going to sit and brag about his crimes the same way other offenders who enjoy talking. Never. Until this day, he hasn't talked. And he's different.
So I wanted to jump into Phil's case really quickly. 36-year-old Phil DiMartino, he was a gay San Francisco man. He was stabbed to death in his apartment on Herman Street. I spoke to his sister, Lisa, who you introduced me to recently. And one of the things she said about Phil was that he was her best friend, and that she felt she had been robbed of somebody who was supposed to be there with her for her entire life. And his his body was found, I think it was August 2nd, 2010. But when a coworker went to check on him, he was last seen, I think, at happy hour on, was it July 30th?
It
So
was the previous Friday. Yeah. So
at a bar in the Castro district.
mhm.
Tell us about that case. I know you worked on that case.
I did. So this case means a lot. Like I said, I think I can find some meaning in every case that I work. You have to find meaning in your work, but every case somehow means something to me. But this was the first case I ever did a profile on.
Mm.
And I remember it very clearly. It was my last day of class in training to become a profiler. I was not a certified profiler when this was assigned. I still had other things I had to do, but I had finished the 16-week classroom training and I was getting ready to go home for the night. And the case came in and it was considered a kind of an emergency, um, in that he had been killed and the San Francisco Police Department, there had been another stabbing of a gay man, and I don't know anything about the case. I other than what I saw in the news, but they were concerned, and I don't think the police
Mm.
department thought that they were connected, but they wanted to kind of head off any questions about, are these connected? Is there a serial killer in San Francisco killing gay men? And I will tell you, I never looked at that other case. So I couldn't necessarily do linkage analysis. But from the facts that I do know, I didn't think that they were connected, but I did not officially do a linkage analysis. So all I looked at was this case, and it was still pretty early on in the investigation. Um, and
Which
so
isn't always normal, right?
it's not normal. Usually they don't come to us until like Weleetka and after years of, of thorough and exhaustive investigation. But this was different. They were just like, do we have a serial killer? And I'm like, I really can't tell you unless I see both cases in their entirety. And of course, I wasn't doing this all by myself, but I did at the time see this case in its entirety. And so, I mean, it remains unsolved and it sticks with me because it was the first case I ever worked on. It's one of those cases I'm always looking at. We
Is
started
it
the podcast.
is it the unsolved case that affects you the most? Just jumping off a question from the chat.
Um, yeah, they're the ones that I don't want to say I care more about, but
Mm.
they stick with me. Absolutely.
Mm.
The ones that get solved, they stick with me too, but in a different way. It's like I mean, for me, and I can say this, I have closure.
Do you
That I'm
think that it's a part? I've heard you say your motivation for doing this work is that you just don't want the bad guy to get away. Is
oh
there
yeah.
something about the family not having that answer and the bad guy getting away that
I definitely think that I can't imagine like family members whose loved ones have disappeared and they have nothing and I don't know how they live with that, or they have a family member who died a violent death and they don't know who did it or why, or I don't know how they live with that. I tend to try not to think too much about that because I don't want it. You have to kind of protect your own emotions as
Mhm.
well. But I don't know how. And so I really do focus on, I just want to get the person and make them pay for what they did, or help and assist in some way. And I want to know as well. I have this desire to know things and who did this, why they do it, and they need to be held accountable. So that's a really a strong motivating factor for me getting into law enforcement. But yeah, it bothers me quite a bit. And certainly I mean, the thought of being able to provide answers to families is great, but in terms of when I'm a profiler, I don't have those relationships with the families. Those are the
And you almost like
relationships that
you
the
can't have the
detectives have.
luxury. You also can't have the. I think even the detectives, you can't have the luxury of focusing too much on their pain or it
Yeah.
clouds your judgment.
That's why we have, the FBI and many law enforcement agencies have the victim witness coordinators that can be there for the victims' families and to provide services and counseling. And they're amazing people. They'll take people to court if they need to. The victim witness coordinators that I have worked with in the FBI are some of the most amazing people. And so we have people that do that so that, investigators, detectives can focus on the case. But yeah, the unsolved cases do stick with me, and the podcast that we do, I like to talk about the solved cases because we learn from those, and it gives us credibility where we can talk about, here's what we did and this is what we figured out and what we said and here was the outcome. And I think listeners like to have that closure, but I really I get more satisfaction by covering the unsolved cases, because I just hope there's
It's
just
almost
this
like a continuation of the work that you did before.
continuing the work and keeping the spotlight on the cases. And, I will never give up on these cases. None of them. The cases that were assigned to me and my colleagues that in any way, shape, or form, if I'm allowed to talk about them, there's some cases that, that people don't want us to talk about. So we're not going to. We would only do that as long as we have permission to talk about them. And
Do you get updates on your old cases? Do you do you get updates on things like I know you're friends or you have a relationship with Lisa, so you probably find out some about the case, Phil's case, through that. But do your old colleagues ever fill you in, or the law enforcement agencies let you know what's going on?
We're not privy anymore because we're retired to investigative details, but certainly when there's been a resolution, we'll get like a heads up. So, which is nice, but we're not going to get that with every case, because some cases you're more involved in and other cases you're not as involved in. But yeah, these cases that are not solved will, if we have the permission and the families are okay with it, we're going to cover them on the show, because it's important to keep a spotlight. And I find, I don't know, at least I'm doing something. And, as small a part as it may be, I feel like you got to keep them alive, especially like, a case like Philip's that hasn't really had a lot of attention. It's not a high profile case. It's a crime, I think, very specific to San Francisco, and that it's really important for it to be highlighted in San Francisco because somebody knows this offender. And the one thing I want to say about Philip's case, the offender left his DNA. There's DNA at the scene. The police have, that's public knowledge.
2 long notes as well.
They're actually, I think it was more than that, and they weren't very long. They were just short, and those haven't been released either, in terms of the contents. But they're, I should say, like they're, there's some things you can glean from it, but it's not like these long statements or anything. It's bizarre. It's kind of bizarre staging, I think, but they're short, and they were scattered about the apartment. They did give some indication to this offender, and then based on Philip's, preferences and who he was attracted to, we believe it's probably a darker skinned or Hispanic male, somebody who speaks Spanish, and quite possibly not in any of the databases. And if they're not born in the United States, the forensic genetic genealogy is, more difficult. So, and more challenging. But they do have the offender's DNA. So it's really about getting the word out about Philip's case, about the type of person they're looking for within a certain community. And maybe somebody will recognize some of these characteristics.
I think this too is a great example of where victimology probably played a good role. Like, for the most part, Philip didn't seem high risk except for one thing, and that was picking up guys he barely knew and bringing them home on occasion. And, you know, the fact that, you know, it was a stabbing, it was more personal, he wasn't robbed, it starts to paint a picture of, of it paints a picture of what may have happened that tells you a little bit about the offender. Because when I was listening to your episodes on it, I was like, oh, I've met this guy, not literally this guy, but like the guy who can go from 0 to 100 in no second or really quickly, laughing and joking, and the neighbors are hearing it through the wall to murder that quick. And like, you know, those are characteristics that if you were in that area at that time, it's probably the guy we all talked about at the bar who would be like cracking up, and then all of a sudden he'd be straight to a fight, or, you know, whatever it is. But
Yeah.
I think there's value in that, right? That it resonates, reminds you of people.
Yeah.
And things. And
the great thing about Philip's case, I do believe Philip's case will be solved. I mean, I always think every case is going to be solved, but this has a really good chance because they do have the offender's DNA. All they need is a name. Even if somebody's wrong, I know some people they either can't imagine that someone could do something like what was done to Philip, that they know, or they're concerned, I don't want to be wrong. What if I'm wrong and I've turned someone in, but the police can quickly rule out the person because they have the DNA. And there's no mistaking that this is the offender's DNA in that scene.
right.
So it's not like it's touch DNA and it's just a minute amount and it could have been, you know, transferred there. This is not what this is. There's a significant amount. And so I think it can be solved. And you know, one thing I want to say about Philip is that, you know, in terms of his victimology, he did have this, you know, area in his personal life where he had very high risk behavior. But, you know, what I've learned about him is he's just a wonderful
Beautiful
guy, and he has so many friends and family that miss him to this day. Some comments I received, just people, I don't even know who they are. I still miss him. And I know they must have been his friend. And, you know, in terms of, he was very successful at work. He worked in real estate, and, you know, after he didn't know, but he was getting an award from his job, and his mother and sister went out to accept it after he had been killed. You know, and the reason why he was found is because it was so unusual that he didn't show up to work. So they found him that Monday morning. So, you know, he was just so well liked and loved. And as most of our victims are, there's always, like, you know, as Susan has said on our podcast, everybody has a mother, you know, and but because this was my first case, and also I think because I'm a big sister as well, so I relate to Lisa, this case sticks with me because of that. And I've told Lisa this was my first case, and, you know, I didn't ever talk to Lisa until after I was retired and I was doing the podcast. And you know, one of the things these are not my stories to tell. In some ways, you know, I have a part of them, but
relatable.
I mean, I have my own version of a story and my part in a story. But in a story like this is, you know, this is the family's story, about their loved one. And so I never talked to Lisa until I did the podcast. And so I really relate to her and to Philip even more than I did just thinking this was my very first case. You know,
talking to her and listening to you, it really does sound like a beautiful soul, like we lost something special.
Yeah. The one story she told me is that when he was young, I think this was when he still lived in the Midwest before he went out to San Francisco, but he was younger, and he just wanted to see what it was like to ride around in a limousine. So he rented a limousine for an hour and went around. I think he was really young. So, I mean, just like funny, like, and he loved to cook. And, but anyway, I really, I know it can be solved, and I just look forward to that day, and I'll keep bringing it up when I can. And we may even follow up again on a later episode, just to remind people about it, especially, if our podcast gets a little bigger, because we released this episode and we had hardly any listeners at the time. And, as the audience grows, maybe it'll get to the right person who'll learn
Everybody go
something.
back to the old episode.
And also, if you know anyone in the San Francisco area, in the gay community, um, you know, send it to them. Like maybe somebody will recognize something. That is my dream. I have lots of dreams in my life, but I think my biggest dream would be your podcast helps solve a case.
Yeah.
Like I learned something and that helps solve a case. I think that would be, it's hard to, like, I wouldn't want to pick just one, but if I could ever be a part of that, I mean, it would make everything worth it.
So I've got two questions, and we can just wrap with everybody's questions. One question, which sort of ties into one of my favorite things, or favorite, or not favorite, it's hard to say. So I think most of my listeners know I've had a bunch of people on connected to the series of cases in Idaho and Washington. Lewis Clark, serial killer, who may also have killed someone in Chicago and possibly some people in California, but he's known, he's alive. And one of the things that, several people have done, including me, have been solve some of his puzzles that he's left in classified ads in the newspaper. Like I found a classified ad, it's like 123 letters, and included 5 victims' names fully in there without crossing over in one letter, which is really gifted. And it was awkwardly written. But a person, like him, you've used this phrase, duper's delight. They love sort of like taunting and duping and fooling us. But there's a tendency among the group of people who sort of investigate the case to take, when they solve his puzzles, as literal clues. And somebody had brought up last night in preparing a question for you about the Zodiac killer, should we look at these things for the duper's delights, the people who are actually, part of their fantasy is to fool us all, literally, or are those likely to be lies and manipulation and a part of an extension of the fantasy? And person who asked that question, if I got it wrong, please let me know.
So I think that, I guess it's hard to know, is the duping the puzzle part, or is there more to the duping?
Mm-hmm.
So I think you have to take it all with a grain of salt. Is it a clue? Is it, what you can take from that is this is a person who likes to play games. So you probably need to consider that when the puzzle is solved, is there more to the puzzle? Or
Yeah.
is it another runaround? Is somebody who just enjoys it? It's hard. Or is it, somebody who is giving you a real piece to the puzzle? I don't think you know for sure, but I think you have to consider that you really can't trust the person. You have to just, I don't know that you can take it literally.
BTK, Zodiac keys, just as readily as I might think that they would lie about a victim they didn't want people to know about, or just to fool people, or because it would upset people, I also think they might equally lie, like, and tell us that they claimed a victim that they didn't actually. Because if a part of what, I think about it from Key's perspective, speaking of getting into someone's head, you have this sexually sadistic killer whose fantasy and pleasure comes from killing people. You're incarcerated. You don't have that anymore. I mean, I get why he committed suicide. It makes sense to me. Like, the thing that gives you the most pleasure in life is now taken away from you. But it seemed like his next number 2 was exerting his power and control over the investigators and fooling them and other things like that. So I sort of think when people like Samuel Little do their sketches, or BTK's notebook, or this guy Lewis Clark Valley, or the Zodiac, like, trust nothing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't trust it. Verify everything that you can. Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up Keys again, and the fact that he killed himself and he left, these skulls, 11 skulls that he had, you know, painted in his own blood or something, and people think that could be, well, that means he's killed 11 victims. And you know Bob, one of the people on my show, said, but or is it just his sadistic legend?
Yeah,
Just leaving that, I'm gonna just make people think, maybe it's true, maybe it's not,
my
maybe.
last fu.
Yeah, his sadistic legend. And what a great way to put it. So that's what you have to consider when you're dealing with these
Yeah,
types of
that the
people.
sadism doesn't end at the.
It doesn't. Well, it certainly doesn't end after the commission of the murder. And for some people, I mean, we've seen a lot of offenders that have continued to communicate with families, and that is just an extension. It's exactly what Keys did. I think he was an opportunist, and I think he took the opportunity to take Samantha's debit card and get what he could out of it. But communicating with
He
the
didn't need
family,
it.
yeah,
Yeah.
he would have done that, I think, even if he wasn't getting money out of it, because he knew he was continuing to inflict pain on others. And it was the same reason that the Long Island serial killer called the victim's family, because he's sadistic and he wants
Mhm.
to continue and prolong his sadistic um, taunts. I mean, it's terrible, but that's what you see when you see someone who engages in sadistic murders. You have to consider that they're also sadistic in other ways in their life, including after the offense.
Yeah. Yeah. So we got a question from Kristen, which is about is there any case you really wish you worked on, and what case?
Well, you and I have talked about Karina Holmer in Boston.
Mhm.
I would love an opportunity to take a look at that case. I'm not sure
Isn't it
how much.
crazy how our careers literally kind of like paralleled at different
They
moments?
do. Well,
Yeah.
a lot of places I've been, you're like, "Oh, I worked there. I know I worked in the police department there." Yeah, it's, we know the same areas. I would, yeah, I would like to take a look at that. I would have, I'm just trying to think. I mean, I honestly, Kristen, I think any case that comes out, I'm interested in and
Yeah.
would like to help. I mean, there are cases that are not well known at all that I wish I could be a part of that or help out. And I'm always offering. So, but sometimes it's really up to the investigative agency whether they feel that they want to ask for more assistance. But I would love to have really taken a look at like any of the biggest serial murder cases ever that maybe BAU wasn't involved in. That would be always interesting to me. I mean, I did join the unit because I was very interested in working on serial murder.
Which ones what are some big ones that BAU hasn't been on?
I don't think anyone ever did anything on Zodiac, believe it or not. And that one's been around a long time.
Yeah.
I don't think,
Everybody's
and
fan favorite. BAU wasn't involved in Zodiac. Wow.
I don't believe so. And, BAU didn't get involved in Golden State Killer until they came to us in what, 2011?
Wow.
So, I mean, so that it can take a while before sometimes they come to
But I think
BAU.
about a case like Zodiac, like why wouldn't I mean, not speaking to that case in particular, because you may not know the answer, but why wouldn't you try to tap? I imagine the FBI is involved in it, but why wouldn't you tap the resources? Or maybe they're not because it's all in California.
Yeah. I don't know, just that I mean, it's like a myth that we just come in and take over. We really have to be invited in.
Hmm.
And it's their case, and they can ask for assistance if they want. And if they don't want it or feel that they need it, then we don't need to be involved. And I mean, I can't think of a case I wouldn't want to be involved in to be on or to take a look at if needed. I mean, I'm always interested. It's how I spend my time all the time.
I'm going to connect you with Kathy, whose comment I just put up. She is a researcher on Brandon Schramm's Snake River
Oh, okay.
uh, killer podcast. And yeah, Kathy's neat. She's smart, but I'll connect the two of you on the case that she just mentioned. I assume the comments in the chat about being surprised is the Zodiac piece of it. Do you? I was going to ask you, do you have hope for even those kinds of cases? Those super cold, not a lot of forensic evidence.
Yes. I mean, I think it's always possible. I mean, there are some that I think it's more probable than others, but I do always have hope. We've seen so many amazing developments, even in my time in law enforcement, things that were solved. I mean, who would have thought that Joe DeAngelo would have been caught the way he was caught? Not when I started my career would I ever imagine that that would be something that could be used to catch somebody, which was the investigative genetic genealogy. So yes, I just believe that technique or um, you know science is always developing, and relationships change, and you never know. We're going to get a piece of information. Zodiac's a tough one, but you never know. I always think maybe someday. I mean, I remember when we heard about arrest in a Long Island serial
Right.
killer case. I mean, you're always like, oh my gosh,
Yeah. I remember we
um,
were all chit-chatting that morning.
yeah.
Can you believe it? Can you believe it?
Like, oh yeah. So you always get. I mean, say it was the same thing when they
I
arrested
didn't.
Joe DeAngelo. You're like, oh my gosh. And I mean, but those cases are great because there is forensic evidence available to be tested, and so it. I don't have as much hope for some of the cases that don't have as much forensic evidence, but I always have hope. But that's just how I am.
That's
That's
you.
just
That's
a
how you roll.
like when I had to
You
be
are the
tested in the bureau for my psychology or whatever, they're like, you have a very Pollyanna-ish view of the world, like, which is unusual for someone in your business. And I'm like, I believe,
right.
I believe good things. So I try. Well, I try my best. I mean, I always have hope.
It was interesting to hear you say that, like the ideal or like the thing that would make you happiest would be to help solve a case through the podcast. And you have the podcast, the experience profiling. Just curious, because you're also a true crime fan. What do you think, like the people in the chat and the people who are listening, can do to maybe contribute or help? I know some people like Kathy are researchers, some people like me interview people or whatever it is. But what do you think people in general can do to help when they care about these cases? I can think of one side. I've had Bruce Maitland, Brianna Maitland's dad on, and one of the things that he said, or he started private investigations for the missing, which was a group that helps. It's a really cool group that helps families with people who are missing. So that's obviously something that people can do. They can start efforts like that. Another guest I had on recently said, the most amazing thing for him was when all the friends, family, and random people in the town came out to help with the search for his daughter. And then another guest said, it's just by being there. But what do you think in general people can do to help sort of like solve some of these cases other than listening to our amazing podcast?
Well, I mean, I do think keeping a spotlight on the cases is important so people don't forget. And even though some of these cases we've heard about so many times, you never know who's going to listen to something or see something or hear something and it's going to ring a bell, or it's going to hit a nerve. As I said, relationships change. So, I mean, I think the best thing is to keep things in the spotlight so we don't forget about them, because people, you never know how information may reach someone, and somebody may never have heard something, or they may hear something they never heard before and realize, oh, I have a piece of information I never knew I had. And so I think continuing to talk about the cases and continuing to put out information, accurate information
Mhm.
about the cases, is really important in keeping them, at the forefront. And, it's like, and I think with investigative agencies, it's like anything else. They have a lot to do. They're overworked, and some cases get put on the back burner. But if you keep them in the spotlight, it makes it a little harder to put it on the back burner.
Mhm.
Things like that, keeping things alive. And if you're in an area, exactly, if they're asking for volunteers to do something, and you feel you want to do that, that is so helpful. And to have people in the community come out, where for a family to see how they're supported, that can mean a lot to people. And but everybody's very different.
Yeah,
Some
and we
people.
all have different skill sets. You might
Yeah.
be a therapist, you might be a great researcher, you might be, I don't know, wonderful on social media,
Yeah.
getting attention, but
I mean,
it
start a podcast too.
yeah, right.
If you want
Right.
to highlight, like, if they like, there's some podcasts that are just devoted to missing people.
Yeah.
And that's a passion. And
Yeah,
they
Dana Pohl, who is in here, is one of those people.
stuff like that. Like, if that's what you want to, that's not for everybody, but you can contribute in every, in different ways. But I like the idea of, like, if there's a search or something, and they're asking for volunteers, or showing up at vigils, and show the family support. Um, but for me, it's like continuing to highlight the cases. Not only that, but also, I hope that people that are interested in this field, whether it's profiling, whether it's forensics, law enforcement, they listen to our podcast and they learn something. Or they think, oh, I never thought of doing that before, and that's how this case was solved. Maybe we should try that. So
Yep.
Bob, or Robert, had asked about a case, what we were really wrong on. And the case that we're going to have on, where the detective said we were 110% right. He took some things away from that investigation, not necessarily from us, but some really good ideas that he talks about on the show for other law enforcement information they
Mm,
put out to the public. They actually put out a lot more information than I think most agencies would be comfortable with. And that's exactly what solved the
that's
case.
not the case.
And they talked about how they, from this investigation, they started doing neighborhood canvases differently. And so, I think, if you have some sort of background, you can educate people about things too. And so that's what I also hope, that we're educating the future. We're helping, detectives that haven't thought of something, that they'll learn from the way
Exposing
another
them to a new idea.
investigative agency solved a case. And, so that's my advice. And if you're, like you said, if they're researchers and they want to get on it, there's many podcasts that have researchers, and that put all the information together for the hosts. And we don't have researchers, because we know the cases already generally, or we're having those agencies on our show, so we don't have researchers. But
A
many
lot of
podcasts do.
podcasts do.
Yeah. Mhm.
So once again, we sit down to record an episode and we record two.
Oh.
I just want to close by saying, one of the things that I just really love about
Thank you, Sophie.
one of
Every
the,
now, like, I see the comment. I'm not catching every comment, but so I really appreciate that.
but I was going to echo the same point. I think the consult is neat because I think, just giving you a simple example, going back to Brandon Strand and Snake River, when I went out to Idaho and Washington, I shared with them a bunch of ideas that came from listening to your podcast or talking to you. And I got I don't know who's heard this story, but I remember text messaging. I was walking in the parking lot to meet with Brandon and one of the victims' cousins, and I said, "Oh, the detective's going to be there," and you were like, "Don't bring your own straw."
They're going to try to get your DNA.
Get my DNA, yes.
Like
But
you're meeting with a detective.
the cool thing was I got to sit down with the detective and talk about some of the ideas that you and I had talked about in the case, and even tell her episodes of the consult to go back to. So this idea, I think, of being able to share ideas or approaches, and I don't know if she'll ever use it on this particular case, but she gave me an example of a missing persons case where something like this, or a missing body case where something like this might be helpful. So I do think putting these good ideas, and like you said, really, 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 solid factual ideas. I think you guys do a great job of, being thoughtful, not pitching past reality, not pretending that profiling can do something it can't, and really putting it in a tangible, clear way that enables all sorts of people to do good things with it. So that is my pitch for all of you who have not listened to the consult, to listen to the consult. So,
well, thank you. I know that it's not the most exciting show because we don't, like you said, we don't say what we don't know, what we can't say. And we're very careful about that. So sometimes we don't always have this aha moment where so and so did it. We can't say that. That's why I like to cover solved cases, so there is some satisfaction on it. But we try to make it realistic, and it is realistic. It's all real, but so people really do understand, and we're dispelling the myths about what it can and can't do. And some people, I think it's the be all end all, and other people have no faith in it. And it really is somewhere in the middle. And it can be useful. I mean, every single consultation that we have ever done, anytime we've sat down with detectives, there's always a moment where it's like, I never thought of that, or that's a really good point, or I'm going to take this back to my agency. And when I tell people it can't hurt. And as far as the consults goes, our podcast, whether we're right or wrong, ultimately doesn't matter as long as we're continuing to highlight some of these cases and keep them in the spotlight.
Obviously, think new ways about them, like you did with the JonBenet Ramsey note.
Sometimes it's better to take a fresh, just a fresh look at things, another set of eyes. Let's take another look at this and see if we come up with something different. Maybe we won't, but maybe we will.
Gina makes a great point. The lack of sensationalism is part of the value.
Oh, thank you, Gina. I mean, we really aren't sensational at all. And I have worried about, I hope we're not too boring, but it is really exactly like it's all real. I mean, obviously some of the solved cases, we're just talking about what we did in the past, but we are taking on cases that, like, Jodi Huisentruit, we had never profiled that before. So
that's Mason City, Iowa.
She Mason City, Iowa news anchor who disappeared on the morning of June 27th, 1995. And she's never been seen since. But that was a case we did not work at BAU. And we took that on. We felt there was enough information. We want to be responsible about some cases that people say, can you look at this? Can you look at that? And a lot of them we can't because we don't have access to the case materials that we would need. But with Jodi's case, because she's never been found and there's not a body, there's not an autopsy, we don't necessarily need to see everything we would normally do. So we were able to take a look at that. So that case, we really did it very much like a consult, having Caroline come in and tell us about, the case facts. And she's a retired crime journalist who's been reporting on the case since it happened. So she has a wealth of information. Findjodi.com is their website, and it's phenomenal. And, we did the victimology, and then we talked about, the offender profile. We did talk about one of the main suspects because his name has been out there for a long period of time. We don't always talk about suspects, but if they're extremely well known already, we will discuss them behaviorally.
And that's, by the way, another interesting piece of it, that in sort of the interest of justice part of it, like profiling can be used to rule people out. And that's also a powerful.
And when we talk about like ruling people out or ruling people in, we just call them prioritizing them.
Yeah.
Because one thing, and I think in the old days, if you go back and you read about profiling, it says it's supposed to identify an offender. Profiling does not identify an offender. It can help prioritize them or make somebody more likely than not. And we did talk about one main suspect in this case, and we really felt like he should be, deprioritized as a main suspect. And I think some people were a little mad that we didn't talk about other suspects, but we couldn't because we didn't have enough information on them. There have been other suspects in the case, and we just didn't have enough information to really discuss them and whether they should be prioritized or not. So we didn't really go into a lot of other ones. But we're going to continue to do that. We're working on one case now, and I'm just going to have to figure out how we're going to edit it because we've already recorded 6 hours.
Wow.
We have,
Wow.
I don't know what I'm going to do, Jason, but it is a fascinating case. I think some people will have heard of it. Others,
that's easy.
What's that?
6-day series, back to back to back.
It could be its own entire series. You're right, but we had 2 hours with the prosecutor on the case, and we spent 4 hours with reporters who discussed suspect. I mean, it is, but it's all real. It's not, we're not doing anything we wouldn't normally do. As the host of the podcast, I'm trying to think, how am I going to do this? Do the listeners want to hear every bit of this? But it's all part of how we're getting to.
I'm guessing yes.
And Gina, I will tell you, it's going to be more than 6 hours because we haven't even gotten to the analysis yet. But it's fascinating, and I love doing it. I just love it. It's going to be very interesting. But it's becoming so real that now we're having detectives and prosecutors on our show, and highlighting these cases and doing real profiles on the show, just as if we were sitting in the room. And there's really no difference at this point with some of these.
So there've been a number of comments in the chat about your calming voice and listening to you talk forever. Guys, I want to tell you a secret about Julia. She never listens to her own episodes, and we need to get her to do it. Because then you'll be more confident about how good they are.
Thank you. I listen to my own show because obviously, but I have a hard time because I can edit my own show. If I'm like, why did I say that? I can take it out, but I can't edit other shows. So I just sometimes don't want to know. But as you and I talked about, I have good people in my life who have listened for me. So my husband has pointed out my disfluencies after he took this speech class of some sort. So that's my brother has pointed out my vocal fry. It's terrible.
I think the people in the chat disagree.
Growing up on the West Coast, and at the time that I did, I was Valley girl. It's like, not that I was a Valley girl, but that was the time. Like, oh my God. So.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're going to be doing more cool stuff like this, including with Dana, Paul, and Lexi from the Broken System. We're going to have them on. And Julie, you should check this out. They're doing this investigation into a case in Florida called Seeking Justice. It's going to be a YouTube investigation. But As always, I love talking to you. I enjoy it. I could do it
Thank
forever. I'm
you.
glad we were able to have however many of our best friends join us for the conversation. And I, as always, look forward to more. Anything you want to close on before we go?
I think I'll just close on, if you listen to any of the episodes of the consult, please listen to unsolved cases, and particularly if any of them are in areas where you live. And if you don't listen, share them with people in areas that, you know, if you know people in those areas that may have information. Those are the cases that we need to concentrate on, the unsolved ones. So thank you.
All right, guys, we're going to go bye-bye. And thanks, everyone. And we'll see you soon. This will probably come out for everybody it'll be available on YouTube immediately. If you know anybody else who wanted to listen to it, and then we'll drop it on the podcast feed eventually. See you guys.